Hello, 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 hello. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, wherever you are joining us. My name is Hamid Khayar Umar Defallah. I'm joining in live from N'Djamena, Chad, Central Africa. I'm the founder and the executive director of Chad Innovation Hub, an ecosystem supporting young innovator, entrepreneur, and civic actor across Central Africa. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this month Digital Dialogues, co-hosted by the International Civil Society Center and the Civic Tech and Innovation Network. Before we begin, we just a few quick housekeeping note. You can turn on caption by clicking on the CC and access stream text via the link in the chat. Please share your questions anytime in the chat. We will bring them in later, and join the conversation on social media using Digital Dialogues and ICC Center, and tag us ICC Center and Civic Tech. For accessibility, I'm a Black man in my early 40s, wearing a traditional jalabia from Chad and seated in front of a background. Today's discussion is about local innovation versus big tech control, building digital sovereignty in Africa. It's both urgent and exciting. Across the continent, we are witnesses incredible creativity, local innovators designing solutions for governance, agriculture, education, and social inclusion. Yet many of these innovations depend on infrastructure and systems owned elsewhere. This question is, how do we as African and build and control our own digital ecosystem, one that reflects our value and protect our data and empower our people? To explore these questions, I'm joined by two outstanding panelists who bring deep experience and vision. Philip Ayazika, who's the director of program at Policy in Uganda. I know Phillips because he is also part of the Civic Tech and Innovation Network ambassador. And he's also a technologist and a learning facilitator, leveraging data design, digital tools for inclusive governance and digital transformation. And also I'm joined by Rachel Firestone, a solution designer, digital transformation expert, a community advocate based in Berlin, who work globally to co-create ethical, scalable, and sustainable digital ecosystem. Thank you both for joining us. We are excited to learn from your insight. Muya is not part with us because he is having an emergency and he couldn't join us, the third panelist. Each panelist will have around 5 minutes to introduce, share their opening perspective. Let's begin with a short self-description and accessibility. Let's start with Philip. Philip, please turn on your camera and share your remark.
Thank you so much, Hamid. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Philip Ayazika, speaking to you from Kampala, Uganda, East Africa. I'm an African man in my late 20s. I have on a pair of thick black glasses, medium tall, with black short hair. My pronouns are him and he. Thank you so much. Pleasure being here.
Thank you, Philip, for grounding for your presentation. After that, I would like to welcome Rachel Firestone to join us on screen. Rachel, over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm wearing a black turtleneck and round silver hoop earrings, and I have I have light olive skin and dark curly hair that goes beyond my ears and has significant gray in it. And my pronouns are she, her. Again, special thank you to the Civic Tech Innovation Network in Johannesburg and the International Civil Society Center in Berlin for hosting us today.
Perfect. Now that we have heard from both of you, let's open the discussion. What does digital sovereignty actually means in your own definition? How can local innovator and policymaker turn it into reality? And can we really achieve sovereignty while still collaborating with global technology partner? Let's start with you, Phillips.
Thank you, Hamid. Once again, my name is Philip Ayazika. I work with an organization called Policy. We are a feminist civic technology organization that works at the intersection of data, design, and technology. In the past recent, we've been researching ways through which Africans can take back control of their data, as well as reimagine new ways of technology ownership. This conversation is pretty close to my heart because I see on the call that there's a couple of people that joined us last month, at the end of last month, from the 30th to the 31st of October in Kampala, Uganda, together with the Ministry of ICT and National Guidance, where we are hosting Data Fest Africa, which is our event that we host annually to bring together data enthusiasts, policymakers, creatives, and academics to talk about the future of data in Africa, but also celebrate the progress made. So for me, when I hear you talking about, digital sovereignty, I think the conversation that we're having just a couple of days ago in Uganda, like I've mentioned, was about reclaiming our data futures. And there's quite a lot to unpack in that theme that guided us this year, especially when we're talking about digital sovereignty. So to define digital sovereignty for me, it is just that reclaiming our data features and just taking back control of our data. It's us being able to have control of this data, and also being able to decide, who has access to it, but also making sure that it does work for us. Because a lot of times we've seen that data collected from the global majority has been utilized by the big tech organizations, big tech entities, with little to no value coming back on the continent. So I think for me to just bring this conversation home, I would want to ground it in that, in what our realities are as a continent. So back in the day, of course, in the 19th century, a lot of us knew that even up to date, Africa's gold and minerals are the ones that powered our foreign economies. Today, we see that it's our data as a continent, but also the global south that is powering these foreign economies and the big tech. Of course, each mobile payment, each health record that you put out in these very many, very big systems that are, donated to a lot of our governments from, the big entities, and all the online interactions do fuel a global market. Even as most of our cloud infrastructure and AI deployments are governed and monetized everywhere. So we know that the global data extraction market, including African data, right, was valued, at least from when I checked the numbers, we did the research in 2021, was valued at 2.1 billion, and that was projected to reach over 4.9 billion in 2027. And of course, that does underscore how valuable our data is, but also how our data is being commodified and monetized, often with little benefit returning to our communities, like I've mentioned. And I want to give two scenarios, I think, to bring this point home. One is in 2021, we saw WhatsApp implement a double standard regarding its data sharing policy, where users outside of the EU, including Africa, were generally given an ultimatum. They were told you either accept the new terms, which involved greater data sharing for commercial purposes, or you stop using our platforms altogether. And of course, the option to opt out of data sharing for advertising purposes available in the previous policies was removed for these users, spotlighting both, and these that spotlight both the exploitative terms and the lack of legal protections for collective African data interests. And I will talk about some of the approaches that we've come up with as an organization that we think could help policymakers to keep in mind as they talk about governance of data, as well as issues like AI on the continent. The second scenario that I want to place to all of us to ponder on as we have this conversation is one of the Kenyan 2017 election, that of course where the late, rest in peace, Raila Odinga was, contesting the results of elections. And I remember that the Supreme Court ordered an audit of the election technology system, which of course was hosted by a French company, only for the Kenyan officials to be told that unfortunately the French engineers that are controlling this data and have this data are asleep. So we'll have to wait for them to wake up, right? So, I think for me, both these scenarios speak about data and the need for data and digital systems to be owned, governed, and accessible by Africans and on our own terms. So I think if we are talking about digital sovereignty, we must talk about where are we as a continent in terms of data infrastructure, for example, in terms of policies. Are our policies strong enough to be able to protect us? We do have the AU data policy framework that a lot of partners I'm seeing on this call have also been participating and contributing to the domestication of, including CPESA. And the AU data policy framework sets out principles that can inform policies and practices on digital governance for us as a continent to be able to treat data as a strategic resource, and not just what it is and how we are dealing with it now. Just like we treat our minerals, just like we treat our currencies, the AU data policy framework sets up a framework that we could use to treat our data as a strategic resource. But I think beyond the domestication of these laws, if we're speaking about data sovereignty, we're going to have to also talk about harmonizing the laws that are coming up in the different estates to ensure privacy and protect local interests, because this also speaks to the issue of local innovation, which I know is also at the top of this conversation. And we keep talking about why aren't, for example, African innovators and innovations, scaling and crossing borders, because there's still a lot of issues around sovereignty and the protectionist approach that a lot of states are taking to be able to protect this data. So with the harmonization of laws, we will see that we'll get to a point where our local innovations are able to scale. Because if you're looking for alternatives, just like the movement has been happening against big tech, we need to create our own innovations. And there's lots of innovations coming out of the continent, but the laws are not yet there to be able to protect that. But as I wrap up and give it back to you, Hamid, I want to also talk about Africa's local innovation, because I think every time we're talking about Africa's local innovation, we sort of frame it as just the startups. But the recognition that Africa's digital ecosystem is very diverse, and it extends far past the VC-driven startups. It does encompass a lot of grassroots civic tech entities. For example, the Civic Tech Innovation Network that is hosted by the University of Wits, that a lot of us are part of, myself and Hamid. There's lots of civic tech organizations that are part of that network. So it does encompass those. It does encompass the public digital infrastructure, the open data initiatives that are, community-led solutions that are working on education, health, and agriculture. So as you speak about local innovation, local context does matter. Imported algorithms and platforms often misrepresent our realities and reinforce inequalities. So I thought that I should put that out. So as we talk about local innovations versus big tech, I think we are not seeing enough. Of course, there is investment, but I don't think we're seeing enough investment coming out of even African governments themselves, in as much as building local talent, supporting scholarships, and African-led research and development. Definitely, I don't want to downplay the efforts that are being made, but we do need to see more investments, especially coming from governments. And I think from a report that I read recently by CPESA, for those that were part of the Forum on Internet Freedom in Namibia recently, on AI and the digital economy, we do see that there's lots of innovations coming out of the continent to tackle disinformation, to tackle health, especially out of West Africa with countries like Senegal. So we do want to see initiatives like those that are led by the government that are pushing for local or African-led research and development. So one thing stands out when we talk about local innovation and the adoption and the development of lots of these digital products is being able to make sure that the next wave of coders and ethicists design systems that focus on the Afrocentric values. And of course, one might ask, what are these Afrocentric values? These are simply fresh lens to decolonizing and centering African people's perspective in the development, deployment, or even procurement of digital systems. I mean, we're going into the election as Uganda, and just the other day, the Electoral Commission shipped in thousands of machines. So even as we procure these digital systems, we do need to understand that we need a contextual socio-technical analysis as opposed to a historic universal approach. So if given more time, I'll go ahead to, sort of flesh out what these values might look like, especially when we're talking about, grounding AI in African values, etc. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that powerful and grounded reflection. You help us a little bit connect the big idea of digital sovereignty to real African experience, like the two example you give it, WhatsApp double standard, to the striking example of Kenyan election data being asleep. The story remind us that data control isn't abstract, it's political, economic, and deeply personal. To come back to you, Rachel, you have worked across continent, like helping community build ethical digital ecosystem, but big tech also still they own most of the tool and infrastructure we use every day. Do you think truly digital sovereignty is even possible without breaking free from those systems, or it is more about learning to play smart within them?
Thank you, Hamid, and thank you, Philip. I have so many questions already, so I'm looking forward to how this conversation progresses. Hamid, to answer your question just really briefly, it's a great question, and I think it's both, for better for worse. And Hamid already gave a short bio about me, so I'll just say a little bit more to kind of talk through how my experience relates so that it'll help me go through some of these answers to the questions and more questions. So I'm a solution designer and digital transformation specialist, and that means that I work with users to co-design and use digital tools, including AI-driven tools, to meet their needs safely and on their terms. And I spent several years working with the Center for Civil Society in Delhi, India. I've worked with innovation spaces in Kenya, Ghana, Mali, and Somalia, and I've worked with the World Bank. And then with a technology startup called Hala Systems that develops digital tools for civilian protection and war crime accountability. And today I work as a freelancer, particularly in the health and humanitarian space. And now, so as Philip already said, when we talk about digital sovereignty versus big tech, we're talking in large part about dominance and control and how to retain independence. And when you read in the newspapers about digital sovereignty, a lot comes up about markets, like advertising and retail and social media, but it's really also, and perhaps even more so, about the data and all the processes and infrastructure of using data, including the operating systems and software and cloud infrastructure. And I think it would be a very big step to say completely throw everything out from big tech, because then perhaps there isn't enough there to pick up. But I would like to talk about the space beyond regulation to bring up 3 areas where actions and tools can help people and organizations and governments to use and develop and then govern technology independently without being beholden to foreign firms or foreign governments. And I also don't want to downplay regulation too much. So it is a really important area where government and civil society fight back. And some example regulation categories are anti-monopoly measures, data protection, and interoperability requirements. Philip also talked about some more examples. And it can also take a long time. And as we know, global asymmetries can make it harder for some countries to assert regulatory control. So in terms of non-regulatory action, I want to talk about these 3 areas. So at the national level, while each of these 2 countries are quite politically complicated in their own right, Russia and India have taken certain strategies that could be learned from and maybe taken apart and applied in different ways on the continent in the context of digital ecosystems and digital, ideally public infrastructure. And then at the community and organizational level, including very large or enterprise-sized organizations, which could also be national ministries or state governments, open source software is really key, including digital public goods. And then lastly, and I might not have time to talk about it until we get into the question area, but Federated learning and federated modeling are really exciting strategies that leverage machine learning and AI while protecting local data and local capabilities. And when I say capabilities, I mean skill sets, like people. So national strategies supporting domestic digital ecosystems. We can start with Russia. So before the war in Ukraine started in 2022, and even before Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the digital market in Russia was pretty open to foreign firms and was not yet restricted. But there was still a local ecosystem of alternatives that were actual alternatives to foreign tools, including for social media and search engines and e-commerce. And that was significantly thanks to producing tools in the local language and marketing really heavily the design around local Russian user preferences. And Russia also took action to nudge customers towards domestic services and apps over foreign ones, like action like pre-installing apps on domestic smartphones. And that's something that's not uncommon in the African context, especially for lower cost smartphones. And that's usually done by providers or suppliers as opposed to government and slash or. That doesn't mean that it can't be applied, broken up into different contexts to see how it could be used. And then in India, um, India took a slightly different approach. India's government chose to actively build its own digital infrastructure in order to take up space before foreign firms could come in and impose their own structures. So the India stack is a gov stack that is a key building block for pretty much all government services, and it offers one of the three major aspects of digital public infrastructure, the data exchange pillar, next to the other two pillars, which are digital ID and digital payments. And no system is perfect. We can talk more about India Stack later, but because it was built and it exists and it's used, there was no need or space for government to procure services of a Palantir, for example, or other foreign entity. And then for e-commerce, when India introduced the Open Network for Digital Commerce in 2022, it was kind of like an equalizing mobile money moment for India's e-commerce sector, the whole sector, that the platform basically purposefully undercut the market desirability of Amazon and other big e-commerce giants like Flipkart in South Asia. And it did so in specific ways. I can talk more about how they did that later on. But I also want to talk about open source tools. And right now is actually a really nice time to talk about this because we see a big move in Europe, even this last week, where the International Criminal Court, or ICC, officially announced its switch away from Microsoft, including OneDrive for cloud storage. And they moved to OpenDesk, which is by Zendesk, or Zendis. Zendesk is something else. And Zendis is a publicly owned company in Germany that's actually part of a much bigger, very recent EU level effort to establish digital sovereignty. It's part of an EU level organization that was founded and launched by France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands and came out only last week. And the aim is to build sovereign digital infrastructure vis-a-vis big tech from the US. And earlier and less big of a announcement, but still something to note, several German state governments in recent years have shifted their entire digital operations to Linux as a way to avoid reliance on big tech. So it is happening, and it's happening in Europe, which is a place that's actually quite conservative about digitalization and taking action in a digital way. Don't quote me on that though. And I also want to talk about a huge open source and country ownership success story that takes place very much on the African continent by talking about DHIS2, which some of you might already be familiar, but for those of you who aren't, it's an information management platform that enables you to safely collect and manage and manipulate data at an aggregate and individual level, and which has transformed national health system management and now data management for education and last mile logistics, especially in low and middle income countries. And this tool is basically used in over 130 countries. And if my info is correct, that includes pretty much every country on the African continent at either the national or subnational level. So that's really significant. And at the same time, it's open source solutions or OSS are absolutely not the solution to everything. Susan, I see your question. It's DHIS2. It has a longer definition, but it goes by that. So it's not a magic bullet, especially in low resource settings, because open source solutions often require a lot of customization and work at the back end from the user side, right? And so one needs to have local or in-house capacity. And that's actually the main reason why many technology implementations using open source, especially in low resource environments, fail. But the DHIS2 example is exciting because it also shows how much success you can have when open source is paired with support. So, for example, communities of practice in this case, or COPs. And there are other ways that the stewards that manage the code of open source solutions can support and provide tiered support. But COPs really have demonstrated success, and they're a big piece of building and ensuring user capability. And Philip, you were talking about the skill sets and the capacity in country, and so this is a way to do that. And other COPs for software can be found with Red Hat or OpenHIE, the Open Health Information Exchange. These are other two good examples of tech-focused communities that really make a difference. And so I think I'll stop there and I will turn it back over to Hamid. And I can talk about the federated learning and federated modeling as we go into questions. Until I get interrupted by Hamid coming back on, I can also ask, Philip, I had a question for you, and I know you had some questions for me. Maybe you can turn your video on. Just going up to it. Yeah, so I had a question for you, which basically you were talking about enabling local innovation and investments and collaboration and some of the things that are happening, but also still need to happen. So what do you think, for you, what is the missing piece that you see from your end that could enable local innovation to scale? And what do you think civil society can do to really push that? What would be a nudge that would change things from where they are into the scale that we want to see?
Good question. So two things that come to mind right away. Of course, I did speak about data. I did speak about, the actual data sets that local innovators have to work with. And then I did speak about the issue of policy. And then the third thing would be, but let me speak about data as it comes back to my mind. So I think for me, the missing link with African local innovations is the aspect of data that I spoke about that you often see. I mean, the numbers are clear. For example, Uganda, they say most entrepreneurial country. And we've seen that even in innovations. Just the other day, we had a game nook and an exhibition where young people exhibiting, the AI products that are coming out to help with the health, to help with quite a lot of things. And you do see that there's quite some niche ideas coming out of the continent. But I think the data that they do have to work with to inform the development of their products is quite limited. Of course, speaking about, at national level, local innovators having to work with, substandard data sets to sort of inform, features and kind of the innovations that they have to build. So this also limits their scaling, right? Beyond, beyond borders, because a lot of times, again, it doesn't speak to the different contexts. Again, it's very, very clear that, Africa is one of the most diverse continents. So if it can't even sometimes cross borders between the continent, then imagine beyond the between nations, imagine beyond the continent. Then the second thing that I would want to speak about would be, I think, the issue of policy. I did have a third point, but I think the issue around data, the data sets that they do have to work with are limited. So again, this could be because of a lot of policy issues around the harmonized data policies on the continent, that there isn't that trust to allow for the free flow, cross-border flow of data. If only we get to a point where we have harmonized data protection, data governance laws on the continent, which is being facilitated by the EU data policy framework, like I've mentioned, I think we're going to start to move closer to having local innovation scale further beyond their own borders, but also then realize the realization of some of the continental frameworks like the the cross the borderless Africa that we'll be talking about, and the free movement of goods and the free movement of people. I think that's very important. The second thing that I would want to speak about is the contextualizing and innovation speaking to the issues of the people. And I think in the case of AI would do, for example, the Afrofeminist approach to AI as people develop, deploy, or even procure, or even in the governance of AI. We do talk about a couple of principles that we think would be useful, but I think we've developed a product that is called inclusion is not an add-on, because beyond the very many issues and the context that we do live within as a continent, the issue of inclusion is one that innovators have not yet had a grip on, and inclusion is thought about as an afterthought as opposed to thinking about it by default. So for me, if you were to ask me about the missing link when it comes to local innovation, it would be that. But of course, speaking about also the funding ecosystem, I mean, who is giving money to innovators? Who is I mean, we've seen that in the global north, someone will go ahead and clone Netflix, and they'll throw monies at them. They'll clone a calculator, an app or something, and they'll throw monies at them. And then we do have niche innovations coming out of the continent, and there's no one to fund this. So those are some of the issues that for me do come to mind.
Perfect, guys. I'm back. So the first speaker, Philip, grounded the idea of digital sovereignty in Africa, lived realities, describing it as an act of reclaiming control over data, deciding who access it, and ensuring that data work for African society rather than foreign profit. So it's also the compared to the global data extraction to the historical extraction of African minerals, arguing that the continent data now powers global economy with little value returning home. And he gave an example of WhatsApp in 2021 policy change, the Kenya election, and he emphasized the African Union data policy framework, urging that data be treated as a strategic resource than just like gold or currency. The second speaker, Rachel, complemented this by exploring how countries, organization, and community can operationalize digital sovereignty beyond regulation. The highest three area of action, the national strategy, Russian early creation of domestic digital platform tailored to local language and culture, showing that alternative can thrive in Norton. Also, the second point was open source and digital public goods. Open source empower nation that own their data and customize system locally. And success depends sometimes on community of practice and investment in local technical skill, and not just free software adoption. The third point of the second speaker was the federal learning and modeling allow local AI innovation without exporting data, helping build capacity while protection. So she also, pointed that Europe recent action, the International Criminal Court, is switching from Microsoft to an open source platform, and German state adopting, Linux as an example, and how even, advanced economy are reclaiming technology as evidence. So together, the two intention highlight digital sovereignty in Africa is both political and practical project. Politically, it's about agency and fairness in global data flows. Practically is about building local infrastructures, laws, skill, and open system that enable African to design and govern technology on their own terms. We will have to open the floor maybe to some questions before we come back to the real discussion. I have also some question to ask maybe, but yeah, let's open the floor for question. Is there a question on the chat? There is a question of open source versus ownership. You both emphasize on open source and digital public good as pathway to empower, but in reality, many open source projects in Africa, depending on funding, Philip, you brushed a little bit, depending on funding or hosting from outside the continent. How can we ensure that open doesn't just become another form of dependency, but actually build ownership and capacity at home? The floor is yours, Phillips or Rachel. You can take the floor.
I can take this one. And Philip, you're welcome to join as well after. Thank you for the question. I think that it can be used to build capacity at home if you build in the support resources as you try to put in the system. If you just try to take open source and it requires all this work at the user end and you don't have the capacity for that, then it will probably fail or it'll be too hard to keep up and it won't be used. And so as I mentioned before, communities of practice are a good way. Linking universities and data science programs to innovation hubs and to organizations, especially larger organizations that are trying to use open source and use open source sustainably, that can create links to make sure that there are the development teams that can customize the tool to meet the needs. And so there's so many different ways to do it, but I would say that there has to be that thinking and that planning in the decision to take on an open source tool. And I saw a question in the chat. I don't think that the major social media platforms and big tech connectivity initiatives are just neutral infrastructures. I don't think they are at all. And I think it's very hard to just say we won't use them. So figuring out how to use them safely is a big piece. Philip was talking about harmonization in terms of both policy and harmonization of data. And that is a huge piece, I think, for using AI safely, for example. When you, in terms of federated learning and federated modeling, so federated learning is a way of using machine learning at the edge and training models using the data that's local on your phone or on a computer at the last mile and not sending that data back to the center, which is the more traditional way of doing it. And then you have to have data sharing permissions and you also potentially lose control of the data. And federated modeling is doing the whole like running models and running machine learning and running AI algorithms at the edge as well. And there are different protocols and different ways of using that technology, but it requires data harmonization so that the data can be used well and also so that countries can learn from each other. And so that's happening more and more, but it requires a lot of coordination, especially between governments. And it requires agreement from organizations to take it on as well. So there's something called TinyML, which is a methodology and technology of using AI at the edge. And it was first introduced by big tech, but it's being used more and more in low and middle income countries, in low resource settings, and by organizations that are based in those countries. And so that's something that I would say should be looked at more because it's a leaner way of using AI. And the question for data, if there are more tools that can collect the data in a managed way, I don't want to talk too much about DHIS2, but that's one example, and there are many others that are open source, then that becomes a collection point for collecting the data that then you need for AI. So that's one way to go about it. I'll stop there.
I do want to sort of add to the last question that I think Brian did ask that question on what was the question? Give me a minute.
Open your camera, please.
My camera is on. Can you see me?
Yes.
So
Perfect.
Brian did ask on whether social media platforms and big tech connectivity initiatives are just new to infrastructure. I think so. I don't think so. So I don't. Of course, these do not function as neutral infrastructures, but rather, again, like you rightfully put it, they do embody, again, significant structural, powers. And I want to sort of speak about it into perspectives, the infrastructure perspective as well as the culture, because I think the culture perspective does go back to the economic, because we continue to see these platforms as culture machines. So from an infrastructure perspective, these digital infrastructures, say search engines, social networking, the data servers, of course, they are predominantly owned by big tech companies. And I think unlike historical physical infrastructures that we do know, at least on the continent, like the railways or highways, which involved, a sort of a public or hybrid ownership, today's digital infrastructure remains very, very private, which does give big tech vast control over essential digital services that are used globally. So this control sort of confers an infrastructure dominance that we continue to see influence in many societal sectors, even beyond mere communication as it is. We've seen it over and over in the days of COVID-19, where big tech contributed lots of, the designing of public health tools and policies, which of course does reflect their influential role in government functions. The other thing that I want to speak about is a culture and social perspective on how in that reinforces. I think the culture machine. I don't know how to bring it, but uh, we do know that, and we see that social media right now, social media platforms are shaping identity formation and public discourse. So they are no longer just communication tools, but they are powerful social structures that do influence presentation, social interaction, and culture norms. So, and this is what, in the spirit of contextualizing issues, this is what we keep talking about. Even when we are talking about the degradation of African culture, this is exactly what you're talking about. So, we've seen that there's lots of cultural impacts that are reinforcing, big tech's role as a culture machine that continue to influence societal norms, consumer behaviors, which in turn, of course, supports the economic dominance. That's why I say that, of course, this does go back to the economic aspect because of the commodification of social interaction. So, Brian, to answer your question, I don't think these are neutral.
Interesting. I think, the last ad is the AI and the edge, the cultural power of digital infrastructure like social media and things like that, federate learning and AI at the edge, the dual nature of big tech infrastructure, all those stuff are really interesting. And now, what a powerful and thought-provoking, discussion. Here are few takeaway, I think. African innovative ecosystem is alive, but it needs stronger collaboration, investment, and infrastructure to truly thrive. The second is digital sovereignty means agency, the freedom to build and govern technology. And the third is partnership, as are open, ethical, and locally driven will define Africa digital future. I would love to give maybe to both like last minute, maybe you have 2-3 minutes each of you to to summarize, to wrap up. What do you think about, what do you want to send over across a message, Rachel?
I also see, I'm very glad to do that. And I think I'll try to do that by also responding to some questions that speak to that. Because I think, Hamid, you did a really nice job already summarizing some of the key points. So thank you so much. And I had a question for Philip as well. So I see a question from Smart that are there current programs to air and train and invest in local African developers so we don't end up dependent. And there are, I'm sure, many folks on the chat that could also speak to this, but there are very strong innovation hubs in major African cities. They've been around for a while. Some of the earlier ones started in 2013, 14, and they've been growing. And they, like the impact hubs and there are a few different hubs in Nairobi, and I'm not going to name them all, but they are linked up with many developer training projects and organizations, and increasingly, of course, data science is really important and growing. And when these training centers started, it was more on the software side, but I think they're also taking on data science training as well. And universities are increasingly having links with private sector, so something to look into. There's a lot happening, and I think it could be amplified more, especially now with recent funding cuts, putting so much more pressure on the continent and on regional initiatives. And Philip, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I would be really interested to hear more from what you were saying about visibilizing workers and centering digital decisional autonomy. If you have even one sentence or two about that, because I see we still have 10 more minutes. So I turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Rachel. Before I get into it, I think there was also an interesting question that came from the chat section on what concrete steps can African governments and institutions take to ensure that data is stored and processed within Africa. So I think we've sort of touched that a little bit. Sorry, my camera is off. We have touched that a little bit from the conversations that we've been having, and I don't want to dwell so much on the issues of policy and regulation, because I think I've spoken about that so much. But I think the issue of infrastructure development, we do see that lots of data centers are coming up on the continent, because I think one of the issues that we've been still struggling with is the issue of data centers, Africa-owned data centers. So they need to develop tier 3 or tier 4 data centers across the continent, especially through public-private partnerships. That is one. But also going back to the basics of improved connectivity and energy access, because we continue to see even lots of big tech organizations that are on the continent coming to invest in the continent, but because of lots of the connectivity issues, the energy issues, they continue to store data out of the continent. And of course, the issue of capacity, which I think Rachel has also spoken about in detail around promoting talent development. We do want to see more partnerships with African universities and tech hubs that Rachel has been talking about, that are all over the continent, to invest in data science, AI, cloud computing, cybersecurity, etc. So it goes ahead to also speak about the curricula in a lot of our academic institutions. But I do want to speak to your question, Rachel. So earlier on, when I spoke about the principles on how to ground, and I'm going to use the case of AI. How do we ground AI in an Afrocentric in Afrocentrism? Because we continue to see that a lot of the AI that is being developed, adopted on the continent, doesn't sort of speak to the contexts of African people. So when I speak about we do have about 4 principles that we did set out in our piece of work that we did on the Afrofeminist approaches to AI governance on the continent. There's just about 4 of them. One is harmony between collective and individual rights, and this speaks directly into the philosophy of Ubuntu that we've always existed within as Africans, and we've seen it as an approach that has been used in lots of institutions and processes, and it's brought value. So also bringing that in, but also the issue of confronting AI exploitation, visibilizing workers, and centering decision autonomy. So I'm just going to focus on the issue of visibilizing workers, just like you've asked. So the idea of perfect, effortless automation does hides the reality that many invisible workers, often from the global south, that do short-term informal jobs like data labeling, and all these tasks that we've seen, especially workers from out of Kenya do. So because you're dealing with a perfect automation process, ChatGPT, etc., you never get to understand, the many invisible workers that are labeling this data and moderating this content, and supporting the the development of these machines. So when we talk about visibilizing workers, we are sort of bringing to light the issue of data extractivism, because we see that labor extractivism, where big tech companies come onto the continent and leverage the poor policies that are existing, labor policies, but also leverage the cheap labor that is existing. We continue to see that big companies take advantage of this work.
Philip, I have a little bit of provoking question. Can Africa build sovereign AI without, first achieving the big problem of energy and data sovereignty?
Definitely no. I think we would be lying if we said we could. I think those are, when we talk about infrastructure, when we talk about energy, connectivity, these are underlying issues that are sort of not allowing us to leapfrog on a lot of this development. So definitely we cannot, because if you're talking about data centers, if you're talking about development of AI that could scale, these are all foundational issues that we do need. Connectivity, access to the internet, energy, electricity, internet, these are foundational issues. So Hamid, in a short format to answer your question, no, there's no way we can, go ahead to, build our own AI and all these digital infrastructures without having to deal with these foundational issues. I got sort of interrupted by Hamid, but Rachel, I hope I was on the way to answer your question. Back to you, Hamid. I don't know if that was a signal for time, but yeah.
No, well, it's a 6 minute left, yeah. Rachel, what do you see? Like, how can we build an intelligent system that serve, Africa, not just, study Africa, like something that will serve us, will serve African community, Africa, in general, and not just, a simple study, a simple something coming from outside, coming in and, not building from bottom to up, but yeah, from outside, something like taught in New York or maybe in somewhere else, and coming and you say, yeah. So what are your thoughts here, please?
Are you talking about an AI system or another digital system, like a system to collect and manage data, like a
Like
digital health system, for example? What?
let's say, like Africa is in the whole, like all of them, all of the system, we are not yet there. So how can we, we build system? Because most of when we start building system, for example, I am from Chad, Central Africa, a country that is really, been through a lot of things, civil war, landlocked, internet connectivity. We have a lot of problems. And when we hear building system is always an outsider, always an embassy, always some expert from abroad. So how can we avoid just this system of just study Africa? Someone will come for 6 months, a year, 5 years, and after that he leave. And sometimes people do not understand what is the system about, and they were not using it. So how can we build like a system that serve Africa?
So thank you for the question. So if you're talking about a government system, for example, then, and I think this is happening in definitely happening in some African countries. I think Kenya is a good example. The procurement should be careful, right? Like, I think the ideal is that you don't just procure a foreign third-party firm to build the system for you. And you also look at what is there and what communities are actually using, because the last thing you want is to build a system that people on, in communities, even if they're urban communities, don't know how to use, can't use. And it's making sure that the design is local, that ideally the technology provider is local, and that you're bringing the people in the room to make those decisions. Philip was talking about data. Data is a really big challenge. It's the government, digitizing private sector can't happen without data and collecting data. And AI is needed for the data as well. Data is needed for AI as well. And I think one of the first steps is creating structures that can collect the data. It could be really simple. It doesn't have to be a sexy, cool, complicated tool. Ideally, it's really easy to use. And then you have data from your health programs, from your school programs, from the company that is trying to sell XYZ in the markets. And then that is the African data. And it doesn't have to be coming from outside, and it should be coming from the firms that are in-house. I don't know if I answered your question correctly or like in enough detail, but it's a big question. And so I think it's not just following what the US has tried to do and what the big companies are trying to do. It's also talking about market access and not letting big companies just jump in because they have the ability to provide a tool that looks nice, but it might not be something that as I was saying at the beginning with the Russia example, that speaks to user preferences that are needed at the by people in specific areas and countries. Philip was speaking about this as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you so much. I think we are like we have 2 minutes, 1 minute left, so we have to wrap up. Thank you all. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Philip, and our partners, and everyone who joined this conversation we have here today. Goes beyond technology. It's about who we are and who we want to become in this digital area. When we speak on digital sovereignty, we are really speaking about dignity, about the right of African to decide how and when our data, our voice, and our innovations shape our society. We have also heard that sovereignty isn't just about serving or software. It's about people, the student learning to code, to engineer building open source tools, to young creator using technology to tell histories in our own languages. It's also about trusting that we can build systems that serve our community, not just global market. We face challenges, weak infrastructure, limited energy, fragmented policy, but we also have something far more powerful, a generation that see technology is not just profit, but possibility. As we close, let's carry this energy, let's collaborate across border, across the network, and the future we want will not be imported of being written. And this is the closing, thank you so much, guys. Thank you. And we can, follow each other and we can continue in our next dialogue. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.